She had packed everything she owned into one worn suitcase, crossed 3 states on a train that smelled of coal smoke and other people's hope, and arrived in Harlan Creek, Montana, truly believing that her life was finally about to begin. Then Nathaniel Brooks looked at her, looked away, and said 4 words that collapsed every dream she had carried for 800 miles. "This won't work out." He said it quietly, almost gently, as if that made it hurt less. It didn't. If you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel like you weren't enough, stay with me, because this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it, because what happened next in that Montana train station changed everything. The letter had taken 11 days to reach Evelyn Carter in Millfield, Ohio, and she had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds. It was not a love letter. She understood that from the first line. Nathaniel Brooks, rancher, Harlan Creek, Montana territory, was not a man who wrote about feelings. He wrote about facts. He had a ranch of 400 acres. He had a daughter 4 years old who needed a woman's presence in the house. He had been widowed 3 years prior and had no intention of remaining so indefinitely. The agency had matched them based on Evelyn's references: her pastor, her employer at the dry goods store, and Mrs. Adeline Pruitt, who had known Evelyn since birth and described her in her letter as steady, capable, and possessed of uncommon patience. Evelyn had read that description and felt something unlock in her chest. Steady, capable, uncommon patience. Nobody in Millfield had ever called her pretty. Nobody had ever called her remarkable or dazzling, or the kind of woman a man couldn't take his eyes off. But steady and capable, those words felt true. Those words felt like something she could carry. She was 22 years old and had spent most of those years being quietly overlooked. Her 2 younger sisters had married before her. Her mother had stopped trying to hide the worry in her eyes somewhere around Evelyn's 20th birthday. At the dry goods store, she swept the back room and kept the ledger and smiled politely at customers who never seemed to see her as anything more than the girl who handed them their change. She was not unhappy exactly, but she was invisible. And invisibility over time becomes its own kind of suffering. So when the letter arrived, and her mother sat across the kitchen table with that familiar look of cautious hope, Evelyn did not hesitate for long. She asked for 2 days to think. She spent those 2 days walking the same 3 roads she had walked her entire life, looking at the same sky, breathing the same air, and asking herself whether she was brave enough to become someone new. On the 3rd morning, she wrote back to Nathaniel Brooks and said yes. She arrived in Harlan Creek on a Tuesday afternoon in early July of 1884, stepping off the train with her suitcase in one hand and her traveling gloves in the other, squinting into a sun that felt bigger and brighter than anything she had known in Ohio. The town was smaller than she expected: 1 main street, a handful of storefronts, a church at the far end, but it had the feeling of a place that was still becoming itself, still being built 1 season at a time. She liked that. It felt like something she understood. There were people on the platform. More than she expected. Word had apparently spread that Nathaniel Brooks was meeting a mail-order bride that afternoon, and in a town the size of Harlan Creek, that was the kind of thing that drew a crowd. Men in dusty hats stood near the fence. Women in sun-faded dresses clustered near the depot steps. A few children chased each other around the far end of the platform, ignoring everything. Evelyn stood still for a moment, getting her bearings, feeling the weight of all those eyes she hadn't quite expected. She saw him right away. He wasn't hard to find. Nathaniel Brooks was taller than most of the men on the platform, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same granite as the mountains behind him. He stood apart from the crowd with his arms crossed, and his hat pulled low, and even from 20 feet away, there was something in his posture that said he was a man who was not accustomed to being disappointed and was not going to take it well if he was. He was holding a piece of paper. Evelyn recognized it as the agency's profile, her information, her references, perhaps a brief physical description the agency had compiled without her knowledge. He was reading it as she walked toward him, and then he looked up. He looked at her. The crowd went quiet, the way crowds do when something is about to happen that everyone can feel but nobody wants to name. Evelyn kept walking toward him. Her chin was up. Her grip on the suitcase handle was tight enough to hurt. She had rehearsed this moment on the train, the greeting, the handshake, the careful, polite conversation of two strangers deciding whether they could build a life together. She had rehearsed it so many times, it had started to feel almost real. "Mr. Brooks," she said, stopping a few feet from him. "I'm Evelyn Carter, from Millfield, Ohio." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that takes inventory and comes up short. His eyes moved from her face to her dress, to the old suitcase she was holding, and something shifted in his expression. Something that was not cruelty exactly, but was not kindness either. It was the look of a man recalculating. "Miss Carter." His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't carry feeling in it any direction. "I appreciate you making the trip." She felt the word coming before he said it. She felt it the way you feel a storm on your skin before the sky changes. "But I don't think this arrangement is going to be possible." He said it quietly. He was not cruel about it. He did not raise his voice or make a scene. He simply stood there in front of half the town and told her with the paper from the agency still in his hand that she was not what he had in mind. The crowd didn't say anything. They didn't have to. Evelyn heard a woman somewhere behind her murmur something under her breath. She heard a man clear his throat. She heard the children stop running. The entire platform went the kind of still that makes every small sound too loud, and she stood in the middle of it with her traveling dress and her one suitcase, and her careful Ohio manners, and felt the earth go sideways under her feet. She did not cry. She had been not crying her entire life, and she was very good at it by now. "I see," she said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. Later alone, she would be astonished by it, that her voice had held when everything inside her was falling apart. But in that moment, she simply nodded, once tightened her grip on the suitcase, and turned away. She had nowhere to go. That was the part that came to her as she walked to the far end of the platform and stood with her back to the crowd. She had traveled 800 miles. She had $2.40 in the small purse inside her suitcase. She did not know a single person in this town. The agency had given her a one-way ticket because the expectation was that she would be arriving at her future home, not standing on a train platform in a strange territory with no plan and no money and no return passage. She set the suitcase down. She pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment, not to keep herself from crying, but just to feel something solid, something real. Behind her, she could hear the crowd beginning to disperse. She could hear fragments of conversation, a woman saying something about what a shame and a man responding with something she couldn't make out but understood anyway. She heard boots on the platform boards. She heard Nathaniel Brooks's voice, low and brief, saying something to someone near the depot door. She did not turn around. The afternoon sun was dropping toward the mountains, and the air had changed something cooler, moving in from the west, carrying the smell of rain and distance. Evelyn looked out at the street below the platform and tried to locate inside herself whatever it was that was supposed to come next. The thought of walking into the town and asking for help from people who had just watched her be turned away was something she could not yet bring herself to do. The thought of going back was impossible. The thought of simply standing here until dark was the only one that felt manageable. So that is what she did. She stood there. After a while, she heard smaller footsteps on the platform. Quick ones. The kind that belong to someone who hasn't yet learned to slow down. "Miss..." She turned. A little girl was standing 3 feet away, looking up at her with the serious brown eyes of a child who understands more about the world than she should have to. She was wearing a blue dress and scuffed boots, and her dark hair was coming loose from its braid in about 4 different places. She was holding a battered cloth rabbit against her chest with both arms, the way children hold things they are not willing to let go of. "Miss," the little girl said again, in a voice that was almost formal with effort. "Are you sad?" Evelyn crouched down, bringing herself level with the child. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Lily." She said it with great dignity. "Lily Brooks." Evelyn felt the name move through her like cold water. "I'm Evelyn," she said. Lily looked at her for a moment, with that grave, considering look, and then she said with complete sincerity, "You have pretty hair." Evelyn almost broke then. She didn't, but it was close. "Thank you," she managed. "Papa says we have to go now." Lily glanced back over her shoulder, toward where Nathaniel was standing near the depot door, his back to them talking to the station master. "But I don't want to go yet." She looked back at Evelyn. "Are you going to be okay?" Evelyn looked at this child, this 4-year-old girl in scuffed boots, standing on a train platform in Montana, asking a grown woman if she was going to be okay, and felt something she could not name shift inside her. "I'm going to be fine," she said. "I'm a little lost right now, but that's not forever." Lily considered this. Then she reached out and very carefully patted Evelyn's hand with her small one. "When I get lost," she said seriously, "Papa finds me." "That's very lucky," Evelyn told her. "Your papa sounds like a good man." Lily's expression flickered. Something complicated moved through those brown eyes. "He's sad sometimes," she said, "since Mama went away." "I know." Evelyn kept her voice gentle. "Grown-ups get sad too." "Do you have a papa?" "I do. He's far away in Ohio." "Is he sad?" "Sometimes, but mostly he's happy." Lily was quiet for a moment, still studying her with that unsettling 4-year-old seriousness. Then she said very quietly, as if she were confessing something, "I asked Papa if you were the one who could stay with us." Evelyn went still. "What did he say?" Lily looked down at her rabbit. "He said no." She looked back up. "But I think he was wrong." Before Evelyn could answer, Nathaniel Brooks' voice came from across the platform, not harsh, just flat. "Lily, come on." Lily held Evelyn's gaze for one more second, that serious brown gaze that felt far older than 4 years, and then she turned and trotted back across the platform. Evelyn watched her go. She watched Nathaniel take the child's hand without looking in Evelyn's direction and walk her toward the steps. She watched them descend. She watched the crowd finish dispersing into the late afternoon. And then she was alone on the platform, and the sky was going dark at the edges, and the wind from the west was picking up, and the rain smell was getting stronger, and Evelyn Carter sat down on her suitcase and let herself feel the full weight of where she was. She was a stranger in a strange place, with $2.40. The man who was supposed to give her a future had decided she wasn't worth it before she'd said 10 words to him. The only person in this entire territory who had been kind to her was 4 years old and going home without her. She sat there until the station master came out and told her not unkindly that the platform would be closing at dark. She thanked him and asked if there was somewhere in town she might find a room for the night. He told her there was a boarding house on the 2nd Street run by a widow named Mrs. Garfield, who sometimes took in travelers. He told her it was $1 a night if she could manage it. She thanked him again and picked up her suitcase. She had just reached the steps when she heard a wagon pulling up from the direction of the main street. She didn't think anything of it. Wagons came and went constantly in a town like this. She started down the steps with her suitcase. "Miss Carter." She stopped. Nathaniel Brooks was at the reins. Lily was sitting beside him straight-backed and watching Evelyn with the focused intensity of a child who has made up her mind about something and is waiting to see if the world agrees. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. Something was different in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but an absence of the dismissal that had been there before. Like a wall that had been briefly reconsidered. "There's a storm coming," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I was told there might be." "Mrs. Garfield's roof leaks." She didn't know what to do with that. "I see. It's not a good night to be at Garfield's." He was looking at the darkening sky, not at her. "I've got a spare room at the ranch. It's nothing special, but the roof holds." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Lily, who had not taken her eyes off her since the wagon stopped. She thought about pride, and she thought about $2.40, and she thought about the way the rain smell had gotten strong enough now that it felt like a promise. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Brooks," she said. "It ain't charity." He still wasn't looking at her. "The spare room needs cleaning before winter sets in. If you're handy with a broom, we can call it a trade." She stood there on the steps and looked at this man who had humiliated her 6 hours ago, and at his 4-year-old daughter who had asked her not to leave, and at the sky that was getting darker by the minute, and she made the only decision she could make. "One night," she said, "and I'll need a broom." "Fair enough," Nathaniel said. She carried her suitcase down the last 2 steps and put it in the back of the wagon. She climbed up on the other side of Lily. The little girl immediately scooted close enough that their arms were touching. "I knew you were coming," Lily said with great satisfaction. "You don't know anything," Nathaniel told her, but not unkindly. "I know lots of things," Lily said, and reached over and took Evelyn's hand in both of her small ones and held on. Nobody said anything else. The wagon pulled away from the station as the first thunder rolled across the mountains. Evelyn sat between the man who had turned her away and the little girl who wouldn't let go, and she looked out at the Montana dark coming down around them, and she thought one night, "That's all." But one night has a way of becoming something else entirely when nobody's watching. The ranch was 6 miles outside town, and the storm caught them halfway there. It hit the way Montana storms hit, without apology, without warning, all at once. The rain came down so hard it turned the road to mud in minutes. Lightning split the sky somewhere to the north, and the thunder that followed was close enough to feel in the chest. Nathaniel kept the horses steady and calm, with the kind of practiced quiet that told Evelyn he had handled worse than this. Lily pressed herself against Evelyn's side without saying anything, and Evelyn put her arm around the child without thinking about it. Just instinct, and Lily tucked herself in closer and gripped her rabbit tighter. By the time the wagon reached the ranch, all 3 of them were soaked through. The house was dark when they arrived. Nathaniel got the horses settled in the barn, while Evelyn carried Lily to the porch and found shelter under the overhang. The child was shivering. Evelyn pulled her close and rubbed her small arms, and Lily buried her face against Evelyn's neck. "Cold," Lily murmured. "I know, sweetheart. Just a little longer." When Nathaniel came back from the barn, he unlocked the door and they went inside. He lit a lamp in the front room, and Evelyn looked around. The house was the house of someone who had stopped noticing it. It was not dirty exactly, but it had the particular emptiness of a place where someone had given up trying to make it feel like home. The furniture was solid and functional. There were no curtains. There was a fireplace that clearly hadn't been used in months. There was a small pair of boots by the door that belonged to Lily, and beside them a much larger pair that belonged to Nathaniel, and beside those was nothing else. No woman's shoes. No woman's touch anywhere. 3 years, Evelyn thought. He said his wife had been gone 3 years, and the house looked exactly like that. "Lily's room is down the hall," Nathaniel said, already moving toward the fireplace. "I'll start the fire. The spare room is next to it. I'll get you some dry things. My wife had some things in the chest that haven't been moved." Evelyn opened her mouth to say something about the wife's things, then closed it again. This was not the moment for that conversation. She took Lily down the hall. The child's room was the one room in the house that showed any life in it. A quilt on the bed in shades of yellow and white. A few toys on a shelf. A drawing tacked to the wall that showed a stick figure, man, and a stick figure girl. And Evelyn noticed a question mark floating above the space where another figure might have stood. Evelyn found a dry nightgown for Lily in the chest at the foot of the bed. She helped the child change out of her wet dress, working quickly and gently, and Lily submitted to the whole process with the particular docility of exhaustion. When she was dry and warm and tucked in, she looked up at Evelyn with eyes already going heavy. "Will you tell me a story?" she said. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. "What kind of story?" "A good one," Lily considered. "With someone who gets lost and then gets found." Evelyn thought for a moment. Then she began to speak, keeping her voice low and even, and she told Lily a story about a small bird that had gotten separated from its flock and flown through a storm to a place it had never been, and found in that strange new place a warm branch and a safe tree and a sky full of stars it had never seen before. She told it slowly, the way stories want to be told to children who are falling asleep, and by the time the bird found its tree, Lily's eyes were closed and her breathing had gone deep and even. Evelyn sat there for another minute in the quiet. Then she leaned down and brushed the damp hair back from Lily's forehead and stayed there with her hand resting lightly on the child's head. One night, she reminded herself, she left the door open a crack and went back down the hall. The fireplace was going now and the front room was starting to warm. Nathaniel was standing at the window with his back to her, looking at the storm. He had changed into dry clothes and his wet hat was hanging on the peg by the door. "She's asleep," Evelyn said. He didn't turn around. "She likes you." "She doesn't know me." "Lily knows things." He said it simply without sentiment. "She always has. Even before her mother died, she had a way of seeing people." Evelyn stood at the edge of the room, not quite in it. "Mr. Brooks, I appreciate you bringing me out here. I want to be clear that I'll be gone in the morning." He turned then. He looked at her in the firelight, and again she saw that thing she had noticed on the platform, the wall that was being reconsidered. "Where are you going to go? That's my concern." "You've got $2, he said, not accusatory, just factual. Maybe a bit more, but not enough for a ticket back to Ohio. She felt heat in her face. "You don't know what I have. I know what the agency charges for passage and what they advance to the bride. I know what a one-way ticket costs from Ohio, and I know what's left over after that." He looked away again. "I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to be honest about what the situation is." Evelyn stood very still. She was angry, not the hot, loud kind of angry, but the cold, careful kind that builds slowly when someone is right about something you didn't want them to be right about. "Why did you turn me away?" she asked. "What did you expect?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The agency described someone different." "Different how?" Another pause. "Younger." "I'm 22. "I know that now." She stared at him. "You had my letter. You knew how old I was." "There was another letter, before yours." He rubbed the back of his neck in a gesture that might have been the only thing she'd seen him do that looked genuinely uncomfortable. "The agency sent 2 matches. I thought I assumed the information in the second letter and the name in the first were the same person." Evelyn was silent for a moment, parsing this. "You thought you were getting someone else. I thought there had been a mistake." He looked at her directly. "I should have handled it differently. I should not have said what I said the way I said it." It was not an apology exactly, but it was something. Coming from a man who seemed to use about 15 words when other men used 50, it was possibly as close to an apology as he knew how to make. "No," Evelyn said, "you should not have." He nodded once, accepting that. She looked at the fire. She thought about the morning. She thought about Mrs. Garfield's leaking roof and $2.40 and a train she couldn't afford. "I'll take the spare room for tonight," she said, "and I'll clean it before I go as agreed. After that, I won't trouble you." "The room is yours as long as you need it," he said. "That's not charity. The work I mentioned needs doing. The garden's been left. The house it's been left." He paused. "I can pay fair wages for a month's work if you need time to arrange your next step." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment, trying to find the angle in the offer. There was none that she could see. He looked like a man who was uncomfortable with what he'd done, and was trying to correct it in the only way he knew how, which was practical rather than emotional. "Fair wages," she repeated. "Yes." "Paid weekly?" He nodded. "Paid weekly." She considered it. A month. A month was enough time to write home. Enough time to think, enough time to find a way forward that didn't involve walking into this town and asking for help from people who had watched her be turned away on a train platform. "1 month," she said. "I'll keep my own schedule and my own hours, and you'll not interfere in how I manage the house." Fine. And what happened today on that platform, you and I won't speak of it again. It's done. We start from here." He looked at her with something in his expression she couldn't quite identify. Then he said, "You're direct." "Yes," she said. "I am." A beat of silence. Then for the first time, something at the corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. She wasn't sure this man owned anything quite as uncomplicated as a smile. But it was a shift. "All right, Miss Carter, 1 month, starting tomorrow." She picked up the lamp he'd set on the table for her and went to the spare room. It smelled of dust and disuse, and the bed was made up with a quilt that had been there so long the color had faded out of it. She set the lamp down and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the storm working itself out against the windows. 1 month. That was manageable. 1 month to get her footing, earn some wages, and figure out what came next. She unpacked only what she needed for the night. She found her mother's small Bible at the bottom of the suitcase and set it on the bedside table. She lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain. Down the hall, a little girl was sleeping. Across the house, a man with walls around himself was probably not sleeping, probably staring at his own ceiling, reconsidering things. And Evelyn Carter, who had arrived in Montana territory that morning, believing her life was about to begin, and had spent the next few hours watching it fall apart. Instead, lay in the dark in a stranger's spare room and thought, this is not the end of anything. She had been overlooked her entire life. She had been underestimated and passed over and made to feel small more times than she could count. And she was still here. She was still upright. She was still herself. The storm was already passing. She could hear it moving east. The rain was thinning. Tomorrow, she would pick up a broom. Tomorrow, she would start. 1 month. That was all she needed. But she fell asleep before she could finish the thought. And she slept deeply and without dreaming for the first time in years. And somewhere in that sleep, something in her unknotted itself, something that had been pulled tight for longer than she realized. And by the time the Montana sun came up over the mountains and put pale gold light across the floorboards of the spare room, Evelyn Carter had already begun to become someone she hadn't expected. She just didn't know it yet. She woke to the sound of small feet in the hallway. They stopped outside her door. There was a pause that had the particular quality of a child trying very hard to decide whether to knock or simply walk in. Then, a knock, 3 small, serious raps, like someone who had been taught how to do it properly and was very proud of that. "Come in," Evelyn said. The door opened, and Lily stood there in her nightgown with her hair in a wild tangle, and her cloth rabbit tucked under her arm, and her expression carrying the weight of something important. "Papa's making breakfast," she announced. "He burns the biscuits. He always burns the biscuits." Evelyn sat up. "Does he?" "Every time." Lily came in and stopped at the side of the bed and looked at Evelyn with those grave, knowing eyes. "But if someone else made them?" she said carefully, as if laying out the terms of a business arrangement. "They might not burn." "You might be right about that." "I like honey on mine," Lily said. "There's honey in the crock on the kitchen shelf. The second shelf, not the first one. The first one has the salt." Evelyn looked at this small child giving her extremely specific kitchen directions at what was probably 5 in the morning, and she felt something so warm and so unexpected move through her chest that she had to press her lips together for a second. "Second shelf," she agreed. "I'll remember." Lily nodded, satisfied with how this was going. Then she said with slightly less authority and slightly more quiet, "Are you really going to leave in a month?" Evelyn met the child's eyes. Lily was holding her rabbit a little tighter. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said honestly. "That depends on a lot of things." "What things?" "Whether I'm needed here." Lily stared at her for a long moment with those bottomless brown eyes. Then she said very softly, "I need you here." Evelyn looked at her. She didn't say anything for a moment, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't come out wrong. Instead, she reached out and smoothed the tangled hair back from Lily's face, very gently, and Lily stood absolutely still for it, the way a child does when they're being touched tenderly, and they want it to last. "Let's go rescue those biscuits," Evelyn said. Lily took her hand. They walked down the hall together toward the smell of smoke and the sound of Nathaniel Brooks quietly cursing at a pan. And just like that, without ceremony, without announcement, without any of the rituals that are supposed to mark beginnings, Evelyn Carter's life in Montana began. The first morning set the pattern for everything that followed. Nathaniel burned the biscuits. Not just a little. The bottoms were black, and the insides were raw, and he was standing over the pan with the particular expression of a man who has had this exact problem before and has not yet developed a solution for it. He heard them coming down the hall and turned with something that was almost defensiveness in his face, as if he expected to be judged. Evelyn looked at the pan. She looked at him. She did not say anything. She simply went to the shelf, the second shelf, not the first, found the honey, set it on the table, and then went back to the stove and took the pan out of his hands with the calm authority of someone who has decided that a problem needs solving, and she is the one to solve it. He let her. That surprised her. She found flour in this bin and lard in the crock, and she made a fresh batch while Nathaniel stood to the side in his own kitchen, looking like a man who was not accustomed to being moved out of the way and was trying to decide whether he minded. Lily sat at the table watching the whole thing with enormous satisfaction, swinging her legs and squeezing her rabbit. When the biscuits came out right risen and golden and smelling the way they were supposed to smell, Lily announced, "I told you," to no one in particular. Nathaniel sat down at the table. He looked at the plate. He looked at Evelyn, who was pouring coffee into the 2 cups on the counter without having been asked whether she knew where the cups were, because she had looked while she was finding the flour. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But the biscuits needed doing." He picked one up, took a bite. She watched his jaw work, and then the thing at the corner of his mouth did what it had done the night before. Not quite a smile, but its first cousin. He didn't say anything, but he ate 2 more. Those first 2 weeks on the ranch moved like water finding its level. Evelyn did not try to transform the place overnight. She approached it the way she had approached most things in her life, steadily, methodically, without announcing what she was doing or asking for permission. She started with the kitchen because that was where she spent the most time and where disorder cost the most. She organized the shelves so that everything had a logical place. She scrubbed the table and the floor and the windowsill. She found a bolt of plain cotton in the chest in the spare room and cut it into curtains for the kitchen window, hemming them by hand in the evenings after Lily was in bed. Nathaniel watched all of this without comment. He was a man of very few words, she was discovering, not because he had nothing to think, but because he seemed to operate on the principle that most things didn't require saying. He would come in from the range at midday and find something different and stand in the doorway, looking at it for a moment, with that assessing quiet, and then he would sit down and eat whatever she had made and not say anything about the change. But he ate everything she cooked. All of it. Every time. She decided to count that as approval. Lily was easier to read. Lily did not have her father's restraint. Lily expressed everything she felt at full volume and full speed, and what she felt from the very first morning was that Evelyn's arrival was the best thing that had happened in the Brooks household in as long as she could remember. She followed Evelyn everywhere, not in the clingy, uncertain way of a child who is afraid to be left alone, but in the interested, determined way of someone who has found a source of information and is not going to waste it. She asked questions about everything. Why did Evelyn cut the butter in instead of mixing it? Why did you fold the corners of the sheet that way? What are those flowers you planted called? And do they smell? And can I smell them? And can I pick one? And can I put it in water? Evelyn answered every question. All of them. Even the ones that came 6 at a time. Because nobody had ever asked her this many questions in her life, and she found to her own surprise that she loved it. It was on the 11th day that the first real test came. She was in the garden, or what had been the garden before 3 years of neglect had turned it into a contest between weeds and bare earth, when she heard the sound of a wagon coming up the road. She didn't think much of it. Wagons came and went. She kept working. Then she heard Nathaniel's voice from the direction of the barn, and another voice answering it, a woman's voice clipped and carrying even from that distance. Evelyn sat back on her heels and listened without meaning to. The woman's name she learned within the next 30 seconds was Margaret Holloway. She learned this because Margaret Holloway announced herself the way some women do, as though her name was its own credential. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and stood up. Margaret Holloway was perhaps 50, dressed better than anyone Evelyn had seen in Harlan Creek, with the kind of composed, deliberate beauty that comes from money and mirrors, and a great deal of attention to both. She had arrived with a basket covered in cloth, and a companion, a younger woman, who stood slightly behind her and said nothing, and she was talking to Nathaniel with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had been coming to this property for years and felt entitled to it. "I heard you had taken in the girl from the station," Margaret was saying when Evelyn came around the corner of the house. "I thought it was only right to come and see how things were settling." Nathaniel looked up and saw Evelyn. Something moved in his expression, a warning, she thought, or maybe just an awareness that this was about to become complicated. "Miss Carter," he said, "this is Mrs. Margaret Holloway. She has the neighboring property to the east." Margaret turned. Her eyes went over Evelyn with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has spent decades assessing other women and has gotten very good at it. The assessment took about 3 seconds. Whatever conclusion it reached, she tucked it away behind a smile that was perfectly shaped. "My dear," she said, "you must be exhausted after your ordeal. All that traveling, and then well." She let the pause do the work the words didn't need to do. "I've brought a few things. I thought you might be getting settled still." "That's very kind," Evelyn said. She kept her voice warm and her face open. "I'm managing quite well, thank you. Are you?" Margaret looked at the garden with its turned earth and new plantings. "How industrious." Her tone made industrious sound like a word you'd use for someone who didn't know any better. "Nathaniel, I've been meaning to speak with you about the Harvest Cooperative meeting next week. We'll need you there." She turned away from Evelyn as she said it. Not rudely, just smoothly. The way you turn away from something you've finished considering. Evelyn watched her. She felt something in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite hurt, something colder than both. She recognized it. She had felt it her entire life in Millfield, in every room where she was the woman nobody saw clearly. The feeling of being assessed and found beside the point. She picked up her trowel and went back to the garden. Behind her, she heard Margaret say something low to Nathaniel, and then laugh, a light social laugh, the kind that doesn't necessarily mean something is funny. She heard Nathaniel respond with a few words, flat and brief. She did not hear what either of them said, and she did not turn around to look. That evening, after supper, after Lily was in bed, Nathaniel came into the kitchen where Evelyn was cleaning up and leaned against the doorframe and said, "She runs the Valley's social calendar. She's not a bad woman." "I didn't say she was," Evelyn said. "You were thinking something." "Yes," she agreed, "but I kept it to myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She was a good friend to my wife." Evelyn set down the cloth she was using and turned around. "And she thinks your wife's replacement should have been more carefully selected." He didn't flinch. "You're not a replacement." She looked at him steadily. "No, I'm not. I'm glad we agree on that." He held her gaze for a moment longer than she expected, and then he straightened and said good night, and went to his room, and Evelyn turned back to the dishes, and her heart was beating a little faster than it had been, and she spent a few minutes being annoyed with herself about that. 2 weeks became 3. Evelyn wrote a letter home. She wrote it carefully, choosing each word because her mother would read between the lines of every sentence, and she did not want her mother to worry. She described the ranch and the territory and the mountains. She described Lily in considerable detail because she suspected her mother would understand Lily better than anything else she could say about this situation. She described Nathaniel in 3 sentences. He is a private man. He works very hard. He is not unkind. She read those 3 sentences back after she wrote them and decided they were all true and that they were enough. She did not describe the way he had started leaving the coffee made in the morning before he went out to the range, which was new. She had been the one making it every day for the first 2 weeks. But now sometimes she came into the kitchen and found it already there. She did not describe the way he had fixed the broken step on the porch without being asked, or the way she had come around the corner of the barn 3 days ago and found him teaching Lily to whistle, both of them intent and serious about it. Nathaniel's face holding an expression she had not seen there before. She sealed the letter and sent it with the next postwriter and tried not to think about what she had left out. The twist came on a Thursday, 3.5 weeks in, and it came from the last direction she was watching. She was hanging laundry when she heard the riders coming in. 3 of them by the sound, which was unusual. Ranch visitors came 1 or 2 at a time as a rule. She kept working. The voices that reached her were male and official sounding, and then Nathaniel's voice, and then something in the register of his voice changed, and the hairs on her arms stood up. She came around the side of the house. 2 men in town clothes, and 1 wearing a county sheriff's badge, were standing in the yard. Nathaniel was facing them, and even from 30 feet away she could read his body. The particular stillness that she had already learned meant he was very, very controlled about something that was making him want to be the opposite. "A formal complaint has been filed," the man in town clothes was saying. He had papers in his hand. "Regarding the nature of the arrangement here. Miss Carter's presence on this property, given that the original marriage agreement was nullified." "There is no arrangement," Nathaniel said, his voice very flat. "Miss Carter is employed here." "As what exactly?" "Housekeeper. She is paid wages, paid weekly. There is nothing else to discuss." The man with the papers looked at his companion. "The concern, Mr. Brooks, is about appearances. About the impression that an unmarried woman living on your property creates for—" "Who filed it?" Nathaniel said. A pause. "That's a private matter." "Is it Margaret Holloway?" Another pause, which was itself an answer. Nathaniel looked at the papers in the man's hand. His jaw was set like the granite mountains behind them. "Is there a law being broken?" "Not precisely, but—" "Then we're done here." He turned away, and the movement was so final that even the man with the papers seemed to understand there was no further conversation to be had. Evelyn stood where she was while the 3 men exchanged looks, and then the 2 in town clothes got back on their horses, and the sheriff touched his hat in her direction, an apology of sorts, or at least an acknowledgement, and they rode out. Nathaniel didn't turn around right away. He stood there looking at the road they'd come down for a long moment. Then he turned and saw her standing there with her hands still full of laundry and her face completely composed. He walked to her. "You heard that," he said. "Yes." "I'm sorry." She looked at him. He had said those words more naturally this time. Less like an obligation, more like something he actually meant. "Don't apologize for someone else's behavior," she said. "It's not yours to carry." "It happened on my land." "Then it happened on your land." She turned and went back to the laundry. "Is there anything to be done about it legally?" He was quiet for a moment, apparently surprised by the practicality of the question. "No," he said. "She's within her rights to file a concern. It won't go anywhere." "All right." She pinned a sheet. "Then we move on." He watched her work for a moment. She could feel him back there looking at her with that assessing quiet, and she kept her hands steady and her face to the laundry and waited for whatever he was going to say. "Most women would have been upset," he said finally. "I am upset," she said without turning around. "But being upset about it out here doesn't change anything. I'll be upset about it later when there's time for it." A long pause. "That's a very practical way of handling things," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She heard him exhale, not quite a laugh, but the shape of one. She kept pinning laundry. But she felt something shift between them in the air above that ordinary work, and she was careful not to look at it directly, for fear of what it might be. The following Sunday, Margaret Holloway came to church. This was not unusual. Margaret Holloway always came to church. What was unusual was that she arrived at exactly the same moment as Nathaniel's wagon, as though she had timed it, which Evelyn suspected she had. And she came over immediately with her companion slightly behind her as always, and she smiled at Nathaniel, and then she looked at Evelyn, and she said in a voice precisely calibrated to be heard by the people nearest to them, "My dear, how long do you intend to stay? Surely you must have family somewhere who is wondering where you've gotten to." The churchyard went that specific quiet that means people are pretending not to listen. Evelyn looked at Margaret Holloway and thought about the last 6 months of her life in Millfield, the quiet overlooking the careful patience, the years of being the woman nobody saw. She thought about the train ride and the platform and Nathaniel's face when he turned away. She thought about Lily asking if she was going to be okay, and she thought about $2.40, and she thought about the biscuits and the coffee already made in the mornings, and the broken step on the porch that someone had fixed without saying anything. She smiled. It was not a small smile. It was not a defensive smile. It was the smile of someone who has made up her mind about something. "Mrs. Holloway," she said pleasantly, "I've found that where I'm needed is generally where I ought to be, and I'm needed here." She paused just long enough to let that land. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe the service is about to start." She turned and walked into the church. Lily was beside her and had been since they climbed down from the wagon, and she slipped her small hand into Evelyn's as they moved through the door. "What did Mrs. Holloway want?" Lily asked in the carrying whisper of a child who doesn't fully understand whispering. "Nothing important," Evelyn said. "She has a face like when Papa eats something sour," Lily said with great gravity. From somewhere behind them, muffled but unmistakable, came the sound of Nathaniel Brooks coughing very quickly into his fist. The month was almost up before either of them mentioned it. Evelyn had been thinking about it for a week. She had the letter from her mother that had come 3 days ago, warm, careful reading between lines, the way mothers do, asking questions that were really statements in disguise. Her mother wanted her to come home. She could feel it in every sentence. But underneath that, she could also feel something. Her mother was too careful to say that coming home meant coming back to the same rooms and the same overlooking and the same life that had been too small before she left. She was sitting on the porch steps in the evening quiet when Nathaniel came out and stood behind her without speaking. This had become a thing he did, came out in the evenings and stood or sat within proximity without requiring conversation. At first, it had seemed like coincidence. After 2 weeks, she had stopped pretending it was. "The month's up Saturday," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at the darkening sky. "I've had a letter from my mother. She'd like me to come home." He didn't say anything. The silence had weight to it. "But I don't think I want to," she said. She said it carefully, testing the truth of it as she spoke. "I think I want to stay, but I need to understand what that means." "What do you want it to mean?" he said. She turned and looked at him. He was standing with his arms crossed and his face in the shadow of the porch overhang, and his eyes on her with that quality of attention he kept so carefully contained. "I'm not going to be a housekeeper forever," she said. "That's not what I came here for, and it's not what I want." He was quiet. "I'm not going to wait around hoping things change either," she said. "I've done enough waiting in my life." He came and sat on the step beside her. Not close, but in the same space. She could feel the warmth of him in the cooling air. "What are you saying, Miss Carter?" he said. "I'm saying I need to know what I am here," she said. "Because Lily—" Her voice changed. She steadied it. "Because Lily calls me to every meal and holds my hand in church and tells me things she doesn't tell you, and I love her." The word came out clean and true. "I love her, and that's not going to change whether I'm your housekeeper or something else, but I need to know which one I am." Nathaniel looked down at his hands. She watched him the way she had learned to watch him, waiting out the long silence, because that was how he moved through things that mattered, slowly and without shortcuts. "After my wife died," he said, "I decided the safest thing was not to need anyone." "I know," she said. "It's harder to hold on to that than I thought it would be." He looked at her then. "When you've been here," she held his gaze. "I'm not trying to take anyone's place," she said. "I never was. I know that now." A pause. "I knew it before I admitted it." The porch was very quiet. The last light was going out of the sky somewhere behind the mountains. "I'm not asking for promises," she said. "I'm asking for honesty. Tell me if there's a reason to stay beyond the month and I'll stay. Tell me if there isn't, and I'll make other plans." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said simply, "There's a reason." She let out a slow breath. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. That was all. But it was something. It was the most honest thing he had said to her since the platform, and it landed in her chest with a weight that felt like a door opening rather than closing, and she sat with him on the porch steps while the Montana dark came down around them and thought, this is how things begin. Not with declarations, not with promises. With one honest word, and then another, and then the long, careful work of building something real. She did not know yet how hard that work was going to get. She did not know that before the winter was out, she was going to have to fight not for herself this time, but for Lily. Not with words, but with presence. Not against Margaret Holloway, or a man with papers, but against something far older and far colder than either of those things. She didn't know any of that yet. She just knew that she was staying. And in this corner of Montana, in this quiet that smelled of pine and coming cold, and the particular piece of a house where someone had finally started to feel like themselves, that was enough. For now, that was exactly enough. Fall came to Harlan Creek the way it always did, fast and without apology. One morning the air was still carrying the last warmth of summer, and the next morning it wasn't, and the mountains to the west had gone white overnight while nobody was watching. Evelyn felt the change in her hands first in the stiffness of her knuckles when she reached for the coffee in the mornings, and she started keeping a shawl near the kitchen door, the way she had seen older women do back in Ohio, women who had learned to read seasons with their bodies instead of calendars. She was staying. That had been decided. Neither she nor Nathaniel had made a ceremony of it. There was no formal conversation, no new arrangement struck with handshakes. She simply did not pack her suitcase on Saturday, and he did not ask her to. And on Sunday morning, Lily came and knocked on her door at the same hour she always did, and announced that Papa had already burned the coffee this time, not just the biscuits, and life moved forward. But staying and being settled are two different things, and Evelyn knew better than to confuse them. The town had not forgotten what happened on that platform. She felt it every time she went in for supplies, in the way conversations paused when she walked into the general store, in the careful politeness of people who were being polite rather than warm, in the glances that went from her to Nathaniel when they came in together and landed somewhere loaded with opinion. She had grown up invisible, and invisibility had its discomforts. But this was something different. This was being seen very clearly and being assessed by every pair of eyes that found her. And the assessment was rarely in her favor. She had handled Margaret Holloway. She had handled the men with papers. She told herself she could handle the rest. What she hadn't figured on was Eleanor Marsh. Eleanor Marsh was the school teacher in Harlan Creek, a small, precise woman of about 40, who wore her gray hair in a coil so tight it looked like it might hurt, and who had, in Evelyn's limited experience with her, the particular quality of a person who believes that other people's business is everyone's concern when it affects the moral character of the community. She came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with no warning and knocked at the front door with the authority of someone who doesn't expect to be turned away. Evelyn answered it. "Miss Carter." Eleanor looked her up and down with the practiced efficiency she probably used on students who came to school without their homework. "I've come to speak with you about Lily." Evelyn stepped back and let her in. She offered coffee. Eleanor accepted it with the air of someone doing a favor and sat at the kitchen table with her hands folded and her back very straight. "Lily's enrollment in the school has been interrupted," Eleanor said. "She was removed by her father after her mother died, which was understandable at the time. Children grieve. But she is 4 years old now, nearly 5, and she ought to be in the schoolroom with the other children her age." "I agree," Evelyn said. Eleanor blinked. This was apparently not the answer she had prepared for. "She's bright," Evelyn continued. "She already knows her letters, and she can count to 100 without missing a number. She'd do well in school." "Then you'll encourage Mr. Brooks to enroll her." "I'll speak with him about it." Eleanor studied her for a moment. Whatever she found seemed to be unexpected. "I was told," she said, choosing her words with care, "that your influence on this household was primarily domestic." "My influence on this household," Evelyn said pleasantly, "is whatever Mr. Brooks and I decide it is, which is our business and not anyone else's." Eleanor took a slow sip of coffee. Then she set the cup down and said with less starch and more honesty, "She needs other children, Miss Carter. She's been alone out here for 3 years. The other children don't know her." "Then it's past time they did," Evelyn said. "I'll talk to Nathaniel." She did that evening. She sat across from him at the supper table after Lily had gone to get her rabbit from the other room, and she told him what Eleanor had said, all of it plainly and without pressure. She told him she thought Eleanor was right about the schooling. She watched his face while she said it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the pause that meant he was working through something that wasn't simple for him. "She's fine here," he said. "She is fine here," Evelyn agreed. "But there's more she needs that here can't give her. She needs children her own age. She needs the world to be bigger than this ranch." "The world outside this ranch," he stopped, "is where her mother died," she finished quietly. "I know." He looked at his plate. "I can't protect her out there." "No," she said. "You can't. But you can't protect her from the world forever either. And you trying to is going to leave her smaller than she deserves to be." The words landed harder than she intended. She saw it in the way he went very still. "I'm not saying it harshly," she said. "I'm saying it because she's exceptional, Nathaniel. She is the most curious, most alive child I have ever been around, and she is going to need room." He was quiet for a long time. Lily came back into the room with her rabbit and climbed into her chair and looked between them with the alert instinct of a child who can feel the quality of adult silence. "Papa," Lily said. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. "Your face is doing the thinking thing." He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Something moved across his face that was tender and complicated and private. "Miss Carter thinks you should go to school," he said. Lily's eyes went immediately to Evelyn. "With the other children?" "Yes," Evelyn said. Lily turned back to her father. She considered the proposition with the gravity she brought to most things. Then she said, "Would you come get me at the end of the day?" "Every day," he said. "And Miss Evelyn would be here when I got home." Nathaniel glanced at Evelyn. "Yes," he said. "She'd be here." Lily nodded as though this settled the matter. "All right then." She picked up her fork. "Can I have more potatoes?" Nathaniel made a sound that was absolutely a laugh before he caught it and turned it into something else. Evelyn looked down at her own plate. The warmth in her chest was getting harder to be practical about. Lily started school the following Monday. She cried once in the morning, holding the doorframe of the schoolhouse and telling Nathaniel in a voice of great conviction that she had changed her mind. He crouched down in front of her and said very quietly a few things Evelyn couldn't hear. Whatever he said made Lily let go of the doorframe. She walked inside. She did not look back. That afternoon when the wagon pulled up and Lily came running out of the schoolhouse door, she was talking before she reached them, telling them about a girl named Clara who had red hair and could already read full sentences and had let Lily share her slate, talking so fast she was tripping over her own words. And when Evelyn lifted her up into the wagon, Lily wrapped both arms around her neck and said right into her ear, "I want to go back tomorrow." Evelyn held her a second longer than necessary. "Good," she said, "because you're going." It was the same week Lily started school that Evelyn found the letters. She had not been snooping. She had been cleaning the study. Nathaniel had given her permission to organize it weeks ago, said he couldn't find anything in there, and didn't have time to sort it himself. She had been working through the stacks on the desk, making piles of what needed keeping and what could be discarded, when she came across a bundle of envelopes tied with a piece of twine. She almost set them aside without looking. She should have. But one of them was open and sticking out of the bundle at an angle, and the return address on the outer envelope caught her eye, because it was from the marriage agency, the same agency that had matched her with Nathaniel. She stared at it. She did not read it. She put the bundle down and walked out of the study, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, with her hands pressed flat on the table, and her heart doing something uncomfortable and fast. Then she picked up her shawl and went outside and started working in the garden because she needed her hands to be busy. She turned it over in her mind while she worked. The other match. He had mentioned it on the first night another letter, another woman described to him by the agency. She had put that information away and not looked at it since then because it didn't seem relevant to anything that mattered. But now, it was sitting in the study in a bundle of letters tied with twine, and whatever was in those letters was something Nathaniel had kept, which meant it was something that had mattered to him at some point. She was still in the garden when he came in from the range. He came straight to her, the way he'd started doing. Always came to find her first, when he got back before he did anything else, which was a habit that had developed so gradually, she hadn't noticed it until it was already established. "You found something," he said. Not a question. She looked up at him. Bundle of letters in the study, from the agency. He went still. "I told you to clean in there." "I know. I wasn't reading them. I saw the return address." He looked out at the mountains. The muscles in his jaw worked once. "There was another woman," he said. "You told me that, first night. I didn't tell you all of it." He crouched down, bringing himself to her level, and she sat back on her heels and looked at him steadily. "The agency sent 2 matches at the same time. The other woman was from Virginia. She was the agency described her as closer to what I thought I was looking for." "Prettier," Evelyn said. Not bitterly, just plainly. "Yes?" He held her gaze. "And younger. And from a family with more social standing. The kind of woman people in this town would have expected. And you were corresponding with her. For a month, before you arrived." He paused. "She withdrew from the match the week before your train came in. I found out the morning of the day I met you." Evelyn looked at him. Something was settling into place, the expression on his face at the platform. The papers in his hand, the recalculation she had watched happen in his eyes. It was not just that she wasn't what he expected. It was that she was arriving on the same day he'd learned the woman he'd expected was not coming at all. "So I walked off that train," she said carefully, "and you were already angry." "I wasn't angry," he said. I had just spent a month preparing myself to meet a particular person, and the person who stepped off the train was not her, and I handled it badly." "Yes," she said. "You did." "I know that." "You handled it very badly, Nathaniel, in front of half the town." "I know." His voice was quiet and serious. "I've known it since about an hour after it happened." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the morning she had made biscuits in his kitchen, and he had eaten 3 without saying a word. She thought about the broken step on the porch, the coffee already made, the laugh he had swallowed at dinner 3 nights ago. "Why are you still keeping those letters?" she asked. He was quiet. "Because it's easier to hold on to what you thought you wanted," she said, "than to figure out what you actually have." He looked at her, and this time something in his face was open in a way she had not seen before. Not the careful, controlled attention she was used to, but something rawer and less managed than that. "I'll burn them," he said. "That's your business," she said. "Not mine." "I want to," he said. "I should have already." She picked up her trowel and went back to the earth. "Then do it," she said. Not coldly, just simply. And he stood there for another moment, and then he went inside, and that evening after Lily was in bed, she saw the smoke from the study fireplace. He came and found her on the porch. He didn't say anything. He just sat down on the step beside her, the way he had started doing, close but not touching, and they watched the dark together for a while. "I've been thinking about something," he said finally. She waited. "You said you wanted to know what you were here." He looked at his hands. "Housekeeper or something else?" She kept her eyes on the dark. Her heart was doing that fast, uncomfortable thing again. "I told you there was a reason to stay," he said. That wasn't enough of an answer. It was honest, but it wasn't enough. He paused. I think what I mean is, I want you to stay because you're you. Not because the ranch needs someone. Not because Lily needs a mother, though she does. Because you are the most genuinely capable person I have ever watched work. And you are kinder than anyone has a right to be after the way this started. And He stopped. Evelyn turned and looked at him. His jaw was set the way it got when he was pushing through something that didn't come easily. I don't know how to say things well, he said. I never have. My wife used to say I communicated better through fence posts than words. You're doing all right, Evelyn said quietly. He met her eyes. I'd like to court you properly, he said. If that's something you'd consider. Not as an arrangement, not because it's practical, because I'd like to. She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. Then she said, You already burned the letters. Yes? Then I think, she said, that we can start from here. Something happened in his face that was completely unguarded relief, she thought, and something warmer than relief, something he was already pulling back under control, before she could fully name it. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They sat on the porch steps in the Montana dark, and it was ordinary, and it was enormous, and nobody said anything else for a long time, and that was exactly right. The courtship that followed was the most understated thing Evelyn had ever been part of. It looked from the outside almost exactly like what had been happening already. He still worked the range. She still managed the house. Lily still came home from school every afternoon talking at full speed about Clara and the slate and the words she was learning to read. But there were small shifts, things that someone watching closely might notice the way Evelyn noticed things. He started coming back from the range a little earlier. Not every day, but often enough that she stopped being surprised when she heard the barn door in the afternoon light. He would come in and pour himself a cup of whatever she had on the stove and lean against the counter and talk not much. Nothing elaborate, just the kind of ordinary accounting of a day that married people do without thinking about it. He'd fixed the north fence line. The creek was running lower. He'd heard from the Halverson brothers that the winter predictions were worse than last year. She would respond in kind. Lily had gotten a gold star on her letters. She'd put up 6 more jars of preserves. She'd found the place where the kitchen floor was soft and suspected the boards needed replacing before spring. And slowly inside those ordinary sentences, something was being built. She felt it most clearly on the evening he came home with wildflowers. He walked in and put them on the kitchen table, without a word, without ceremony. The way he'd put tools on a workbench, just set them there, and went to wash up. She stood looking at them. They were not elegant. They were the kind of flowers that grew along the fence lines, rough-petaled and wind-worn, and incredibly alive in the particular way of things that have survived by being stubborn. She put them in the crock she used for water and set them in the center of the table. And when he came back, she was finishing supper, and she didn't say anything about the flowers either. And neither did he, and Lily sat down and looked at them and said with complete satisfaction, "Those are pretty." "Yes," Nathaniel said, "they are." His eyes found Evelyn's across the table briefly, and then they both looked away, and Lily looked between them with a 4-year-old's unerring instinct for something she didn't fully understand, but recognized as important. Then November came, and everything changed. It started with a cough. Lily's coughs were not unusual. Children in Montana winters coughed the way they did everywhere. The dry, cold air, the closed spaces of the schoolroom, the ordinary passage of illness through small bodies that were still learning to fight the world. Evelyn had been through 2 rounds of sniffles with her already, and handled both with honey tea and extra blankets and the firm insistence that Lily stay in bed until she was well. But this cough was different from the start, and somewhere in the part of herself that paid attention to things without being told to Evelyn knew it. It started on a Wednesday, deep and rattling in a way that a child Lily's size shouldn't carry. By Thursday evening, her forehead was hot to Evelyn's palm. By Friday morning she hadn't eaten and wouldn't drink, and her eyes had that dull inward look that means a child's body is fighting very hard and losing ground. Evelyn told Nathaniel at breakfast. She told him plainly, the way she told him things, without drama, but without softening either. His face went the color of chalk. He was already halfway to the door to ride for the doctor when she caught his arm. "The road's already bad," she said. "I heard it icing overnight." He stopped. He looked at her. "How bad is she?" "Bad enough that we need to be smart about this," she said. "If you go for Dr. Heller and the road's impassable, you're stuck in town and I'm here alone with her. I need you here." He looked toward the hallway where Lily's room was. His entire body was wire-tight. "I know what to do," Evelyn said. "I've seen this before. My youngest sister had the same thing 2 winters ago. I need boiled water in the mustard tin in the pantry and you to keep the fire stoked in her room. Can you do that?" He looked back at her. For a fraction of a second, she saw him raw and terrified in a way she had never seen him before. All the walls down, all the control gone, just a father who could not lose the last piece of the life he had been building. "Yes," he said. "Then let's go," she said. What followed was the longest night of Evelyn Carter's life. She worked without stopping. She made a mustard plaster and pressed it to Lily's small chest, checking the child's temperature every half hour with the back of her wrist against the forehead. She boiled water and made steam and held Lily's struggling little body upright to breathe it. She changed the blankets when they soaked through. She talked to Lily constantly, not frantic talk, not the kind of nervous chatter that communicates fear to a sick child, but steady, calm storytelling. The same bird from the first night, now finding new adventures, and a family of horses in a valley somewhere warm, and a little girl with brown eyes who was going to feel so much better by morning. Nathaniel did everything she asked. Every single thing immediately without question, with the absolute focused obedience of a man who was holding himself together by the discipline of being useful. He stoked the fire, he brought water, he replaced the blankets. He sat in the corner of the room when she needed him to be still, and he moved when she needed him to move, and he never once asked if Lily was going to be all right, because she thought he was afraid that if he asked, she might have to tell him something he couldn't survive hearing. Around 2 in the morning, Lily's breathing got worse. Not gradually. It changed fast the way bad things do. One moment she was restless and difficult, and the next, she was very quiet and working too hard for each breath. And Evelyn heard that change, and her own heart seized. She looked at Nathaniel across the bed. He had heard it too. "I need you to talk to her," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady. "She needs to hear your voice. Get close to her and talk." He moved to the bed without hesitation. He sat on the edge and leaned down and put his mouth close to Lily's ear and started talking. Evelyn did not hear what he said. She was working, focused and precise, adjusting the steam cloth and checking the child's pulse at the throat, and going back through everything she knew about what her sister had needed in this moment, but she could hear the register of his voice. Low and continuous, and full of something so naked and fierce that she had to close her eyes for just a second. Then she opened them and worked. The fever broke at 4 in the morning. She felt it happen under her palm, the heat cresting, and then with no drama at all beginning to ease. She pressed her hand more firmly to Lily's forehead, and the child stirred and made a sound that was discomfort rather than distress, the kind of sound that means you are returning rather than going, and Evelyn exhaled so hard her whole body shook with it. "The fever's breaking," she said. Nathaniel looked up from the other side of the bed. His face in the lamplight was something she would never forget. Exhausted and wrecked and flooded with relief, in equal measure every wall he had ever built around himself, completely gone. "She's coming back," Evelyn said. "She's going to be all right." He put his forehead down on the bed beside Lily's small hand and stayed there for a long moment without moving. His shoulders shook once. Just once. Evelyn reached across and put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades, the way you do with someone who needs to know they are not alone in the room. And she kept it there while he breathed through whatever was moving through him, and she didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would be better than silence. Lily opened her eyes just before dawn. She looked at the ceiling, then she turned her head and found her father first, and then she found Evelyn, and she looked between them both with the slow, wondering look of a child who has been a very long way away and has come back to find everything still there. "Mama," she said. Her voice was barely a thread. It was the first time. Evelyn felt it go through her like light through water, everywhere at once, everywhere immediately. She leaned down closer to Lily's face and said very softly, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." "You stayed," Lily whispered. "I stayed," Evelyn said. "I'm not going anywhere." Lily's eyes drifted closed again, back into the safe healing sleep of a fever that has broken and a body that is mending. Her hand loose on the blanket uncurled, and Evelyn took it in both of hers without thinking. She sat like that for a long time. She became aware gradually that Nathaniel had straightened, that he was watching her. She did not look up right away because she needed another moment, needed to finish feeling what she was feeling without being observed in it. When she did look up, his face was open in a way she had never seen it. Not the brief, unguarded moments she had caught before. This was different. This was a man who had stopped protecting himself and was looking at her with everything showing. "Evelyn," he said. The first time he had said her name. Not Miss Carter. Her name. She looked at him across the sleeping child. "I know," she said. He nodded. Once. As if that was enough, because between the two of them, it was. Outside the window, the Montana sky was beginning to go from black to gray, to the cold, pale blue of a winter dawn, and the worst night of either of their lives was ending. And something else. Something neither of them had a name for yet, but both of them recognized was beginning in its place. Lily recovered slowly, the way children do after their bodies have fought something serious in fits and starts. Good days followed by days where she slept too long and ate too little, and Evelyn learned to read the difference between the two and adjust accordingly. She kept Lily home from school for 2 weeks. She made broths and soft breads and sat beside the child's bed in the afternoons, reading aloud from the small collection of books she had brought from Ohio, and Lily listened with her eyes half closed and her rabbit tucked under her chin, and her color gradually stubbornly coming back. Nathaniel hovered. There was no other word for it. The man who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of emotional distance now could not seem to stay more than 20 feet from his daughter for longer than it took to do the work that absolutely required his presence. He came in from the barn at odd hours to check. He ate his meals standing in the doorway of Lily's room rather than at the table. He asked Evelyn the same questions he had already asked in different arrangements, as though the answers might change if he came at them sideways. She answered patiently every time. She understood it. She had felt the same terror that night, and she carried it differently because she had something to do with it, but she understood the shape of what he was working through. On the 4th day of Lily's recovery, he came into the kitchen late at night when Evelyn was finishing the dishes, and he stood in the doorway and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something." She set down the cloth and turned around. His face had the quality it got when he had been sitting with something for a long time and had finally decided to stop sitting. "My wife didn't just get sick," he said. "She got sick because I didn't take it seriously fast enough. She had a fever for 3 days before I rode for the doctor. I thought she was strong. I thought she'd come through it the way she always came through things." He stopped. She didn't. Evelyn looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. "I have spent 3 years," he said, "believing that if I had moved faster, she would still be here. And when Lily's fever went the way it did the other night, I was back in that room, the same room, watching it happen again." "But it didn't happen again," Evelyn said. "Because of you." His voice was stripped of everything careful. "You knew what to do and you did it, and you didn't panic and you didn't wait. You moved. Nathaniel, I need you to know," he said, "that what you did that night was not something I will ever be able to repay. Not with wages, not with anything ordinary." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't do it to be repaid. I know that." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and stopped in front of her and looked at her from very close. Close enough that she could see the exhaustion still living in the lines around his eyes, the thing that the last 4 days had stripped away and not yet put back. "That's why I need to say it. Because you did it just because it needed doing, because she matters to you." "She does," Evelyn said, quietly, simply. No modifier needed. You called her sweetheart, he said. That night, every time you spoke to her. She hadn't known he'd been listening that closely. Yes, she said. My wife called her that. His voice was not broken when he said it. It was something else, careful, like touching something that used to hurt and finding it still tender but not impossible. I hadn't heard it since. Evelyn held his gaze. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that with him, silence was not absence. It was the shape of things being said that didn't have words yet. I know I'm not her, she said finally. No. He shook his head. You're not. You're something different. Something I wasn't looking for and didn't know I needed. A pause. Something I don't want to lose. She felt her breath catch. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I know you keep saying that. He looked at her steadily. I'm starting to believe it. Coming from this man in this language that was everything. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face just briefly, just one moment, and he closed his eyes and leaned into it the way a person does when they have been carrying something alone for a very long time, and someone has finally offered to help with the weight. Then she dropped her hand and stepped back and turned to finish the dishes, and he stayed in the kitchen a little longer than he needed to before he went to bed, and neither of them said anything else, and that was how it was between them. The most important things held in the smallest gestures, the biggest moments passing quietly and permanently. The first real crack in Harlan Creek's resistance came from an unexpected place. It was Clara's mother. Clara was Lily's school friend, the red-haired girl who had shared her slate on the first day, and her mother was a woman named Ruth Dawson, who ran the millinery shop on the main street and had a directness about her that Evelyn had always privately liked, even on days when that directness was aimed in uncomfortable directions. Ruth came into the general store on a Saturday morning in December when Evelyn was there for supplies, and she marched up without ceremony and said, Your girl saved my daughter from a rattlesnake last week, and nobody thought to tell me until yesterday. Evelyn blinked. What? In the schoolyard. Lily spotted it before any of the other children did, and she pulled Clara back and yelled for Miss Marsh loud enough to wake the dead. Clara didn't even see it. Ruth shook her head, and her eyes were bright. Brave little thing. 4 years old, and she didn't freeze. Evelyn felt pride so sudden and fierce it almost embarrassed her. She didn't tell me. Well, she wouldn't, would she, modest? Ruth looked at her squarely. I want to bring Clara out to the ranch to play, if that suits. It would suit very much, Evelyn said. Ruth nodded once, brisk and settled. Good. I've been wanting to introduce myself properly for a while. I would have sooner, but... She paused, and the honesty in her face was refreshing precisely because it was uncomfortable for both of them. Frankly, I was letting myself be influenced by people who had opinions they had no business having. I've thought better of it. Evelyn looked at her. I appreciate that. Don't appreciate it. Just have coffee ready on Thursday. Ruth picked up her parcel from the counter and headed for the door, and then she turned back and added, For what it's worth, the whole town knows what you did for Lily during that fever. Nathaniel's been close with his words his whole life, but people talk, and Dr. Heller heard enough when he came out to check on her. She paused. Opinions change, Miss Carter. Slowly, but they do. She left. Evelyn stood in the middle of the general store and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for months. Ruth Dawson came on Thursday with Clara and a lemon cake, and the two little girls disappeared into Lily's room within 5 minutes and did not emerge for 2 hours. And Ruth sat at Evelyn's kitchen table and drank 2 cups of coffee and talked with the frank, rolling energy of a woman who had been waiting a while for a real conversation. She talked about her husband who had died 4 years ago and left her the shop. She talked about Clara, who she was raising alone and who she worried about constantly, with the specific worry of a parent who knows their child is capable but fears the world will not make room for it. She talked about Margaret Holloway with a sighing tolerance that told Evelyn more about Margaret than any direct accusation could have. She's not a bad woman. Ruth said, which was almost word for word what Nathaniel had said. But she was very fond of Nathaniel's wife, very. She held her cup. And I think she's spent 3 years imagining that Nathaniel would eventually turn to her for guidance at least. Maybe more. Your arrival disrupted a plan she hadn't admitted to herself she had. Evelyn absorbed this. I see. She'll come around, Ruth said. Once she sees there's nothing to be done about it. She smiled, not Margaret's polished social smile, but something real and a little wry. And I think the town is starting to see that there is in fact nothing to be done about it. Evelyn looked at her carefully. What does the town see exactly? Ruth set her cup down and looked at her with the direct Montana frankness that Evelyn had come to find bracing and necessary. They see a woman who stayed when she had every reason not to. They see Nathaniel Brooks smiling at supper in the hotel last week, which nobody has seen in 3 years. And they see Lily Brooks coming to school every morning looking like a child who is loved. She paused. In a town this size, Miss Carter, that is more persuasive than any opinion Margaret Holloway has ever expressed. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. Then she said, He smiled at supper. Ruth raised an eyebrow. He didn't tell you. He was in town for the cooperative meeting. He took supper at the hotel after. Ruth's expression was entirely composed. He apparently told Frank Hollister, who was sitting at the next table, and has the biggest mouth in the county, that his housekeeper made the best biscuits in Montana Territory, and he didn't know why he'd bothered eating anywhere else. Evelyn looked down at her own cup. She was smiling before she could stop it. I see, she said. I thought you might, Ruth said, and refilled her own coffee. The proposal came on a Thursday evening in late December, and it came entirely without warning, which was exactly how Evelyn would have predicted it, because Nathaniel Brooks did not rehearse things. He encountered them, and he dealt with them, and the dealing was always honest, even when it was imperfect. He came in from the barn and found her in the kitchen, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, Lily asked me this morning if you were going to be her mama for real. Evelyn turned from the stove. He was looking at her with that open-faced directness that she had seen more and more since Lily's fever, since the walls had come down, and he had apparently decided not to rebuild them entirely. What did you tell her? She said. I told her I needed to ask you first. She set down the spoon she was holding. Ask me what exactly? He crossed the kitchen. He stood in front of her, and he was a head taller than her, and twice as broad across the shoulders, and he was holding his hat so tight the brim was creasing, and something about that. The large, capable man, undone by nervousness, over a woman who had spent 4 months making his biscuits, broke something open in her with great tenderness. I'm not good at this, he said. You're doing all right, she said, the same thing she had said on the porch. He remembered it, she could see it, in the way the corner of his mouth moved. I want to marry you, he said. Not because the ranch needs a woman, not because Lily needs a mother, even though she does, and you are your everything she needs, Evelyn, but because I want to be the man you come home to, because I want to be worth the 800 miles you traveled to get here, because I have watched you every single day for 4 months and I cannot imagine this house without you, and that terrifies me more than anything has in a long time, and I would rather tell you that than spend another month pretending it isn't true. The kitchen was perfectly quiet. She looked at this man, this stubborn, private, genuinely good man, who had turned her away on a train platform, and burned letters, and fixed broken steps, without saying so, and held his daughter's hand at 2 a.m, and smiled about biscuits at the hotel in town. And she felt something settle inside her, with the finality of something that has found its right place. You said I could only stay if you chose me because of who I was, she said. Not because of what the house needed. Yes, he said. I remember. Is this that? Yes, he said. This is that. She held his gaze for a long, quiet moment. Then yes, she said. He closed his eyes for just a second, 1 second, of undisguised relief, and then he opened them and looked at her with everything showing and said, Yeah. Yes, Nathaniel. And she was smiling now fully with nothing held back. Yes. He put the ruined hat down on the table. He reached out and took her hands in both of his, and his hands were large and work-roughened and very warm, and he held hers carefully, like something he was aware of having nearly lost. "I'll do right by you," he said. "I know I haven't always." "You have," she said. "For a while now you have." Down the hall, small feet hit the floor at speed. The door flew open, and Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with her rabbit and her wild hair, and her expression already lit with the knowledge of a child who has been listening at doors and is not remotely ashamed of it. "Did she say yes?" Lily demanded. Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. "She said yes." Lily let out a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a cheer and launched herself across the kitchen. Nathaniel caught her with one arm, her small body crashing into his side, and she wrapped both arms around his neck and then reached out and grabbed Evelyn's hand and held both of them at the same time, with the fierce, possessive joy of a child who has been waiting for this exact moment longer than either adult had realized. "I knew," Lily said into Nathaniel's shoulder, muffled but certain. "I knew since the train station." "You were 4 years old at the train station," Nathaniel said. "I know lots of things," Lily said. "I told you." Evelyn laughed a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she had not let herself have in a very long time. And Nathaniel looked at her over the top of Lily's head, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do before, completely undone, completely open, undefended and clear, and she thought, there it is. There is the man who was under all that granite, and she had found him, or he had found her, or they had found each other in the wreckage of a bad beginning, which was, she thought, the best kind of finding there was. The town found out 3 days later because Lily told Clara, who told Clara's mother, who told Ruth Dawson, who was not the biggest mouth in the county, but was thoroughly connected to the woman who was. By Sunday, it was common knowledge in Harlan Creek that Nathaniel Brooks had asked Evelyn Carter to marry him, and she had said yes, and the response was not what Evelyn had feared. It was not unanimous enthusiasm. There were people who still had their opinions, but the balance had shifted somewhere in the month since July shifted quietly. In the way that opinion shifts in small communities, not all at once but incrementally. One interaction at a time, one observation at a time. Until a critical mass of people has decided that the consensus they had been maintaining no longer reflects what they actually think. Ruth Dawson was first through the door of the general store on Monday morning to offer her congratulations loud enough that everyone else in the store could hear them. Frank Hollister, who had the biggest mouth in the county, shook Nathaniel's hand at the feed store and said loud enough for the street to hear that it was about time. Miss Eleanor Marsh came to the ranch on Wednesday with a gift, a small book of children's verses she thought Lily might enjoy, which was how Eleanor expressed approval Evelyn was learning. Not with warm words, but with practical tokens. And Margaret Holloway came on Friday. She came alone without her companion, which was itself unusual. She knocked at the front door in the late afternoon and stood there when Evelyn opened it with an expression that was doing a great deal of internal work that didn't quite make it to the surface. "Mrs. Holloway," Evelyn said. "Come in." "I won't stay," Margaret said. She was carrying a small wrapped package. She held it out. "For Lily. For the engagement. She's very fond of sweets, and I happen to have some made." Evelyn took the package. She looked at Margaret steadily. Margaret's composure held, and then fractionally briefly it didn't. Something moved in her eyes that was real rather than managed. "I want to say," Margaret said, "that I handled things poorly, early on. The filing." She paused. I had expectations about how things in this valley would proceed that were my own and not anyone else's business, and I acted on them when I shouldn't have." "Thank you," Evelyn said. She said it simply, without making Margaret work for it any harder than she already was. "I appreciate that." Margaret nodded. "You love Lily." "Very much. She would have loved Margaret as a grandmother," Margaret said, then caught herself. "My mother's name. My mother loved children." A pause. That's neither here nor there." "It isn't," Evelyn agreed kindly. "But Lily would love to have more people in her life who care about her. That's not something we have an excess of." Something softened around Margaret's mouth. "No," she said. "I suppose not." She left shortly after. Evelyn stood at the door and watched her go and thought about the enormous complexity of people, how much damage someone can do while still being fundamentally lonely, how much harm comes not from malice, but from the collision of unexpressed hopes with circumstances that don't accommodate them. She thought about herself at the train station, her own unexpressed hopes, her own collision. She thought everyone is trying in the directions they know how toward the things they need. The distance between people comes from those directions not lining up. She closed the door and went back inside. Lily was at the kitchen table with the book Miss Marsh had brought, sounding out words with her finger moving under each letter. She looked up when Evelyn came in. "Who was it?" "Mrs. Holloway. She brought you sweets." Lily's face did the complicated thing it always did at the mention of Margaret. "She's nicer now," she said carefully. "A little," Evelyn agreed. "You were nice to her even when she wasn't nice to you," Lily said. She said it matter-of-factly, the way children state things they have observed and incorporated into their understanding of how the world works. "I tried to be," Evelyn said. Lily looked at her. "Why?" Evelyn sat down across from her and thought about the honest answer for a moment. "Because being unkind back doesn't change anything," she said. "It just means there are two people being unkind instead of one." Lily considered this with her usual gravity. Then she said, "Papa says you're the smartest person he knows." Evelyn felt warmth move through her chest. "Did he?" "He said it to Mr. Hollister at the feed store, and Mr. Hollister told Clara's mama, and Clara's mama told me." Lily delivered this information with complete serenity, apparently unconcerned about the chain of transmission. "I told him I already knew." "Did you?" "You figured out his biscuit problem on the first day," Lily said. "That told me right away." Evelyn looked at this child, this extraordinary solemn, entirely herself, child who had spotted her on a train platform and decided in the span of one conversation that she was staying, and felt a love so complete and uncomplicated that it had no room for anything else in it. "Come here," she said. Lily came around the table without being asked twice, and climbed into her lap and settled herself with the practiced ease of a child who has been doing this for months and considers it a natural law. She put her head against Evelyn's shoulder and pulled her rabbit up under her chin. "Evelyn," she said. When you and Papa get married." She paused, choosing words the way she did when something was important to her. "Can I call you Mama? For real? Not just when I'm sick or scared." Evelyn pressed her lips together hard for 1 second. Then she turned her head and kissed the top of Lily's hair. "You can call me that any time you want," she said. "You already could have." "I know," Lily said. "But I wanted to ask right." Evelyn held her. The kitchen was warm and the afternoon was going gold outside, and somewhere out in the barn, Nathaniel was finishing the day's work before coming in. And in 3 months, they would stand in front of the Harlan Creek Church and make promises in front of everyone who had once watched Evelyn walk off a train platform with nowhere to go. And it would mean something different than it would have meant in July, harder won, more certain, built on the specific knowledge of what it had cost to get there. But all of that was later. Right now, there was a little girl in her lap who had asked to call her Mama, and she said yes, and Lily tucked herself in closer, and they sat together in the warm kitchen, while the last afternoon light came through the windows, and Evelyn Carter held her daughter and did not look away. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday in March. Evelyn had not wanted anything large. She told Nathaniel this plainly, the same way she told him most things directly without apology, with the calm certainty of a woman who had spent enough years being overlooked to know exactly what she did and did not want now that someone was finally asking. She wanted the church, the pastor, and the people who had actually earned the right to stand in the room. She wanted Lily in a new dress. She wanted Ruth Dawson in the front row. She wanted it honest and small and real, Nathaniel said that was fine with him. He said it with the particular relief of a man who had been quietly dreading the alternative. What neither of them anticipated was that Harlan Creek had its own opinion about what the wedding of Nathaniel Brooks should look like, and that opinion had been quietly organizing itself for weeks. Ruth told her 3 days before, sat her down at the kitchen table with coffee, and said without preamble, "Half the town is planning to be there." Evelyn stared at her. "What do you mean, half the town?" "I mean Frank Hollister told the Halverson brothers, who told the women's circle, who told the school children, who told their parents, and somehow it became an event." Ruth wrapped her hands around her cup. "I want you to be prepared. It's not going to be the small thing you asked for." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about July. She thought about the platform and the crowd, and the way those same people had stood and watched and said nothing. "Why?" she said. Ruth looked at her evenly. "Because you earned it," she said. "Whether you were trying to or not. People in this town have been watching you for 8 months, and they have decided something, and apparently they want to be present when it becomes official." Evelyn picked up her coffee. She looked at the table. She thought about her mother, who she had written to, and who had written back with a letter so full of barely contained emotion that Evelyn had read it 4 times. Her mother could not come the distance, and the cost were impossible, but she had sent a lace handkerchief that had been her own mother's, and instructions to tuck it into the bouquet, and a full page of advice that was mostly love-wearing practical clothes. "All right," Evelyn said finally. Ruth blinked. "You're not upset." "I was upset in July," Evelyn said. "When they watched him turn me away, and nobody said a word." She paused. "If they want to come now, I'll let them. People change. I'm not going to punish them for it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head slowly. "You are something else, Evelyn Carter." "Brooks," Evelyn said, "in 3 days." Ruth smiled wide, genuine, the kind that reached all the way up. "In 3 days," she agreed. The morning of the wedding arrived cold and clear, the kind of March morning that Montana makes when it is briefly deciding to be beautiful before remembering it doesn't owe anyone anything. Evelyn dressed in the room that had been the spare room, which she still thought of as the spare room, even after 8 months, because the shift from spare room to her room had happened so gradually she had never quite caught the moment of it. Lily was her greatest assistance and her greatest impediment in equal measure. She had appointed herself chief of preparation and took the role with the seriousness of a small general. She stood in the doorway in her new yellow dress, which Ruth had made because Ruth turned out to have an extraordinary hand with fabric, which was perhaps not surprising for a woman who ran the millinery shop, and she provided a running commentary on everything Evelyn did. "Your hair is crooked." "Thank you, Lily." "The left side, not the right side. The left side is lower." "I see that." "Do you want me to fix it?" "I think I can manage. Papa can't do his tie. He's been trying for 10 minutes. He'll figure it out." He said a word I'm not supposed to say. Evelyn looked at her in the mirror. "About the tie." "About the tie." "Go tell him I said to leave it and I'll do it when I come out." Lily disappeared. A minute later, the sound of a man's voice saying something short and resigned came from across the house, and then quiet. Evelyn turned back to the mirror and took a slow breath. She looked like herself. That was what struck her, not more beautiful than herself, not transformed, but more fully herself than she had ever looked in Ohio. Something in her face had settled. The careful wariness that had lived around her eyes for most of her adult life was not entirely gone, but it had moved aside for something else. Something that looked like a woman who knew where she stood and had decided she was glad to be there. She pinned the last piece of her hair and picked up her mother's handkerchief from the bedside table and held it for a moment. She thought about her mother in the kitchen in Ohio, reading between the lines of every letter. She thought about the 2 younger sisters who had married first, and the years of being the one left over. She thought about the marriage agency letter arriving on a Tuesday, and the way she had read it so many times, the paper went soft. She had come 800 miles for a man who didn't want her, and she had ended up exactly where she was supposed to be. She tucked the handkerchief into her bouquet wildflowers from the ranch, the same rough-petaled, wind-worn kind that Nathaniel had put on the kitchen table without ceremony months ago, and she went out into the hall. He was standing at the end of it. He had managed the tie. She didn't know how it was not perfectly done, slightly off-center, but it was done, and he was wearing his good coat, and he had gotten his hair to cooperate. And he was looking at her with the expression she had first seen the night Lily's fever broke. Open. Fully open. Nothing held back. Evelyn walked toward him, and when she reached him, she reached up and straightened the tie without a word, and he stood perfectly still for it, looking down at her. And when she dropped her hands, he said very quietly, "You look beautiful." She had been called steady and capable her entire life. Nobody had said beautiful. She felt the word like something physical. "You're biased," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "Entirely." Lily appeared from behind him and grabbed both their hands. "Can we go now?" she said, with the urgency of a child who has been patient for approximately as long as she is able. "Clara is already there, and she's been there for a whole hour, and she said she's going to save me the front seat, but I don't know if she actually will." Nathaniel looked at Evelyn. Evelyn looked at him. Something passed between them, private, warm, full of the particular humor of two people who have found each other in the specific chaos of a life that includes a 5-year-old with strong opinions. "Let's go," Evelyn said. The church was full. Not half the town, the whole town, or close enough that the distinction didn't matter. Evelyn walked in on Nathaniel's arm with Lily holding her other hand, and she looked at the rows of faces, familiar and less familiar, friendly and carefully neutral, and a few still working something out behind their eyes, and she took a breath and walked steadily up the aisle. She saw Ruth in the front row as promised, with Clara beside her, in a dress that matched Lily's yellow in a way that was clearly not accidental. She saw Eleanor Marsh 3 rows back with the focused expression she brought to all significant proceedings. She saw Frank Hollister, who was already emotional in a way that suggested he took weddings very seriously. She saw near the back Margaret Holloway sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her chin up and her face composed, and their eyes met briefly, and Margaret gave the smallest of nods, acknowledging something, some private concession that had been worked through over the months since the afternoon she had come to the door with sweets for Lily. Evelyn nodded back. Then she looked forward. The pastor was a man named Horace Kemp, who had been in Harlan Creek for 20 years, and had the practiced steadiness of a man who had stood at this altar for all manner of occasions, the happy ones and the hard ones, and had learned to hold space for all of them. He looked at Evelyn and Nathaniel with the particular warmth of someone who knew both their histories and was glad to be standing in this specific moment of them. He said the words, "The old ones. The ones that have been said so many times they have worn smooth as river stones, and in that smoothness they still carry everything." When he got to the part about the vows, he looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel turned to face her fully. He had her hands in both of his, and he was looking at her with that open face, and he said in the voice that had once been flat and unrevealing, and now to her ear, at least the ear that had learned to read him, carried everything. "I told you I wasn't good at words. I still ain't. But I'll tell you what I know." He paused. "I know that I turned you away on this town's platform 8 months ago, and that was the worst decision I almost made. I know that you walked into a house that had stopped being a home, and you made it one again without asking permission or making a fuss about it. I know that you love my daughter like she is yours, and she is yours, Evelyn. She has been since the first night. And I know that I want to spend the rest of my life being the man you decided I was worth staying for." The church was so quiet, she could hear someone in the back trying not to cry and not quite succeeding. She squeezed his hands. "My turn," she said. He nodded. She looked at him, this stubborn, private, genuinely good man, and she said, "I came here with nothing but a suitcase and a letter, and the belief that somewhere there was a place where I would not be overlooked. You looked right past me the first day, and I thought I had been wrong." She felt the church listening. She didn't care. But then a little girl grabbed my hand and wouldn't let go, and her father turned up with a wagon in a storm and offered me a broom in exchange for a roof. And I thought, Well, that's something. That's honest. I can work with honest. A soft sound went through the pews. Ruth Dawson was smiling so hard it looked like it might hurt. I don't need to be told I'm beautiful every day, Evelyn continued. I don't need ceremony or promise or a life without difficulty. I need what we already have, honesty and work, and the kind of love that shows up in fixed porch steps and coffee already made and wildflowers on the kitchen table. She took a breath. I promise to choose you every day, not because it's the arrangement, because it's the truth. Nathaniel's jaw was working. He was holding her hands very tight. Yes, Pastor Kemp said in a voice that held a smile. I think we can proceed. When it was done, and they walked back up the aisle together, Lily between them, holding both their hands, and practically levitating with joy, the church erupted in the particular sound of a community that has been waiting for something to feel good about. It was not polished. It was loud and genuine and slightly chaotic, which was exactly what Evelyn would have wanted if she had thought to want it. Frank Hollister was in fact crying, openly and without shame. Best thing I've seen in years, he announced to no one in particular, which for Frank Hollister was a form of restraint. The celebration moved to the largest open space in town, which was the livery side yard, because the church hall was not big enough, and because someone Ruth Evelyn suspected had organized the community potluck with the efficiency of a military operation. Tables appeared. Food appeared. Music appeared in the form of 2 fiddles and an accordion played by men who knew what they were doing and were clearly glad to be doing it. It was the most alive Evelyn had ever seen Harlan Creek. She stood in the middle of it and watched Lily drag Clara through the crowd on some mission of enormous 5-year-old importance, and she watched Nathaniel get cornered by the Halverson brothers and the expression on his face as he endured their good-natured assault with stoic tolerance. And she thought about July. She thought about the platform, and the $2.40, and the woman from Virginia who had withdrawn, and the letter in Nathaniel's hand. She thought if any of it had gone differently, I would not be here. If the woman from Virginia had not withdrawn. If Nathaniel had handled the platform with more grace, and she had turned around and left. If the storm that night had not come, if she had not been stranded, if Lily had not walked across the platform with her rabbit and her grave brown eyes and asked a grown woman if she was going to be okay. All those near misses, all those pivot points where the story could have gone another way. She was still standing there caught in the strange gratitude of it when Ruth appeared at her elbow with 2 cups of something warm. You look like a woman thinking too hard on her wedding day, Ruth said. I'm thinking about contingencies, Evelyn said. She accepted the cup. Everything that could have been different. Don't, Ruth said simply. It wasn't different. This is what happened. Drink your cider. Evelyn drank her cider. Nathaniel found her an hour later when the light was going golden and the fiddles had slowed to something easier and people were beginning to drift toward home in the satisfied way of a community that has eaten well and celebrated something real. He came up beside her and stood there for a moment without saying anything the way he did, and then he said, Are you all right? I'm wonderful, she said. She meant it completely. Good. He put his hand at the small of her back, a gesture so natural and unthought that she understood from it everything she needed to know about how far they had come. Lily's asleep on Ruth's lap. She made it further than I expected. She told Clara at some point today that she had known since the train station this was going to happen. He said it with the particular tone of a man who is amused and doesn't want to be. She apparently considers herself responsible. She is somewhat responsible, Evelyn said. Don't tell her that. Her head won't fit through the door. Evelyn laughed. He pulled her slightly closer, and they stood together in the last of the afternoon light while the celebration wound down around them, and it was so ordinary and so enormous that she couldn't hold both of those things at once, and so she just held the warmth of his hand at her back and let the rest of it be. The years that followed were not perfect. She had not expected them to be. There were hard winters and lean years, and the particular difficulties of a territory still becoming a state, still settling its own arguments about land and law and who had the right to what. There were disagreements between her and Nathaniel that were real and sometimes loud, because they were both people with strong opinions and a tendency to dig in, and the disagreements did not always resolve quickly or cleanly. There were nights when she missed Ohio, more than she expected to miss her mother's voice and the particular green of the Ohio hills in June, and she wrote letters that tried to carry that missing somewhere productive rather than letting it become something corrosive. Nathaniel was not a man who transformed completely. He remained private, remained sparing with words, remained the kind of husband who showed love through consistent action rather than consistent declaration, which was sometimes exactly what she needed, and sometimes harder to receive. They learned each other. Slowly, with friction and patience, and the occasional spectacular argument that left them both exhausted and oddly closer. What remained constant was this: he showed up. Every day, in every way that mattered, he showed up. And so did she. Lily grew. She grew the way children who are loved grow, fast and confident and thoroughly herself, in ways that regularly surprised everyone around her, including the people who thought they knew her best. She went back to school and thrived. She and Clara became the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences and invent their own language, and get into exactly the kind of trouble that ends with both sets of parents being very proud and pretending not to be. She read everything she could get her hands on. Evelyn ordered books from the catalog and from a contact in Billings, and eventually from as far as Chicago, and Lily read every one of them, and then wanted to talk about them at the dinner table, with the intensity of someone who takes ideas personally. Nathaniel engaged with these conversations with a seriousness that Evelyn found genuinely moving. He was not a reader himself, had never pretended to be, but he listened to his daughter with the full weight of his attention and asked questions that pushed her further, and Lily would talk for an hour and come up looking like someone who has been fed something essential. It was Lily, when she was 7, who gave Evelyn the idea for the school library. She said it simply the way she said most important things. The school doesn't have enough books. Miss Marsh has to use the same ones every year, and some of them are wrong already. Clara said there's a school in Billings that has a whole room just for books. She looked at Evelyn across the table. Why doesn't ours? Evelyn looked at her. Then she looked at Nathaniel. He was looking at his plate with a very specific expression that meant he already knew where this was going and had elected to be neutral. Because nobody's built one yet, Evelyn said. You could, Lily said, as though it were obvious, as though Evelyn were simply someone who built things and the only question was what. She could not get the idea out of her head after that. She started small, organizing a donation drive, writing to publishers in Chicago and St. Louis, convincing Ruth to donate a corner of the millinery for temporary storage. She talked to Eleanor Marsh, who had softened considerably over the years, and who turned out, when approached with a specific and well-organized proposal, to be a formidable ally. She wrote letters. She attended county meetings. She argued calmly and persistently, and with the particular effectiveness of someone who has learned that being underestimated is a tactical advantage until the school board allocated a room. She filled it with books. It took 2 years of sustained effort and the occasional Nathaniel Brooks donation, which he made quietly and without wanting credit the way he did most things. The day the library opened, Eleanor Marsh stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves, and then looked at Evelyn and said, in the carefully measured tones of a woman who does not give compliments freely, "This is a significant thing." "Lily's idea," Evelyn said. "It was your doing," Eleanor said. "Both," Evelyn said. "That's how it works best." The twist that neither of them saw coming arrived on an April morning when Lily was 8. A letter came from Ohio. Not from Evelyn's mother, who wrote regularly and whose letters Evelyn could predict with her eyes closed. From the marriage agency, the same agency that had sent her to Montana 4 years ago. She opened it at the kitchen table alone, the way she read most of the mail before Nathaniel came in from the range. She read it once quickly. Then she set it down and read it again slowly. The agency had been engaged by a family in Columbus. A well-established family, they noted, with considerable resources. They had reviewed their records of successful placements and Evelyn's name had been recommended not as a potential bride, but as a reference and consultant. The wife of Nathaniel Brooks, formerly Evelyn Carter, had been described by multiple sources in Harlan Creek as an example of what a successful match and a well-managed frontier household could look like. They wanted her to write a guide, a practical manual for women considering the journey west. Her experience, her adaptation, her methods. For other women who were standing where she had stood, holding a letter that promised a beginning in a place they had never been. She sat with the letter for a long time. When Nathaniel came in for midday coffee, she handed it to him without saying anything. He read it standing at the counter. He put it down. He looked at her. "What do you want to do?" he said. "I want to write it," she said. He nodded, as though he had expected nothing different. "It'll take time," she said. "Evenings mainly, and I'll need to correspond with people. It might be months." "All right. You don't have an opinion about it." He looked at her steadily. "My opinion is that you have more to say to women in that situation than anyone I can think of." He picked up his coffee. "And that you'll do it right." She looked at him across the kitchen. This man who had been her husband for 3 years and who still managed to surprise her, still managed to be more than she had reached for on any given day. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Write the thing." She wrote the thing. She worked at it for 5 months in the evenings at the kitchen table with Lily, sometimes doing her own letters and numbers across from her in companionable silence, and Nathaniel reading in the corner, and the fire going, and the ranch settling into the night sounds she knew as well now as her own heartbeat. She wrote about practical matters, what to bring, what to expect from the journey, how to read a household, and establish yourself in it without diminishing yourself in the process. She wrote about the harder things too. About arriving somewhere that doesn't want you. About the gap between expectation and reality and how to stand in that gap without collapsing. About the difference between being needed and being wanted and why it mattered to insist on both. She wrote one chapter that she almost didn't include. She titled it, "What to Do When He Turns You Away." She wrote about standing on a platform with $2.40 and a broken dream, and about the small girl who asked if she was going to be okay, and about the man with the wagon who offered her a broom in exchange for a roof, and about everything that had grown from that night. She sent it to the agency in Columbus. 3 months later, she received a response telling her that the guide had been printed and was being distributed to women considering Western placement across 5 states. She read the letter at the kitchen table. Lily was at school. Nathaniel was on the range. The house was quiet around her. Her house, the kitchen she had organized, and the curtains she had cut, and the floor she had replaced, and the garden she had built from nothing. The house she had walked into on a stormy night in July, with a suitcase and a deal about a broom, the house that was hers in every way that mattered. She put the letter down and looked out the window for a long moment. Then she got up and put the coffee on because Nathaniel would be coming in from the range within the hour, and she had bread in the oven, and Lily would be home from school by mid-afternoon with her full report on the day and the life that was hers. The real one, the one she had built rather than been handed, was waiting. Ruth Dawson threw a celebration when the news got out, because of course she did. It was smaller than the wedding, but warmer in its way, just the people who had been there from the good parts of the beginning, which was enough. Eleanor Marsh brought a plant for the kitchen windowsill. Margaret Holloway, who had over the years become something that wasn't quite friendship, but was genuine mutual respect, the kind forged between 2 strong women who have stopped being on opposing sides, brought a bottle of something from her late husband's cellar and said it was for a significant occasion, and this qualified. Lily sat beside Evelyn at the table and ate her cake and listened to the adults talk and said eventually with great precision, "I told you you could build a library." "You did," Evelyn agreed. "And now you've written a book." "A guide, not quite a book." Lily looked at her with those brown eyes that had always seen further than they should. "Same thing," she said. "You put the words down, and now other people can read them. That's a book." Nathaniel across the table met Evelyn's eyes. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Years later, when people in Harlan Creek talked about Evelyn Brooks, and they did with the particular warmth of a community that has claimed someone as its own. They talked about the library and the guide and the dairy business she built from the kitchen garden, about the school board meetings, where her voice was the one that ended arguments about the way she had made the Brooks Ranch into something the whole valley pointed to. But the ones who had been there from the start talked about something else first. They talked about a July afternoon on the train platform. They talked about a woman arriving with one suitcase and nowhere to go. They talked about a little girl in a blue dress who walked across the platform and asked the rejected woman if she was going to be okay, and about a man with a wagon who showed up in a storm and offered the worst deal in the history of frontier courtship one night, a broom and a room with a faded quilt. They talked about what grew from that. Ruth Dawson, who outlived most of the people in this story and told it at every opportunity, always ended it the same way. She would get to the part about the wagon in the storm, and she would pause and look at whoever she was talking to, and she would say, "And that is the thing nobody tells you about second chances. They don't arrive looking like second chances. They arrive looking like a man who burned his biscuits every morning of his life, and a little girl who refused to let go of a stranger's hand, and a storm that kept you from leaving when you should have stayed." Evelyn Carter had come to Montana territory with a letter and a suitcase, and the fragile, stubborn belief that somewhere in this world there was a place that would not overlook her. She had been right. She had found it not in the place the letter promised, but in the place the storm left her, in a house that needed a broom and a child who needed a story, and a man who needed to remember that love is not a thing that happens to you. It is a thing you choose. Every morning in the ordinary light, with burned biscuits and broken steps and wildflowers set on a table without ceremony. It is a thing you build. And Evelyn Brooks had built something that lasted. Not because she was the woman anyone expected, not because she arrived the right way or was chosen at the right moment, or fit the plan that had been made for someone else, but because she stayed when staying was hard, and she worked when working was unglamorous, and she loved with the full weight of everything she had, and she never, not once, not for a single day, let anyone convince her that she was only the woman who had been turned away. She was the woman who built a home from a storm and a broom, and a little girl's whispered words, and everything that mattered in Harlan Creek, Montana, in the years that followed, had her name on it somewhere. And that was enough. That was in fact everything.